Okay, so the book of Jonah. If I could see all of you right now, I would ask for a show of hands as to how many of you are familiar with this book. And I would imagine that probably every single one of you would raise your hand. Of course, I'm familiar with Jonah and the whale. But if I asked for a show of hands to show me how many of you have thoughtfully studied this book, I would imagine that less of you would raise your hands. And that's because in our context, the first place that many of us heard about Jonah is in Sunday school, or from the Talking Vegetables, VeggieTales. And by the way, I'm not knocking VeggieTales, and I'm certainly not knocking children's ministry, but I am pointing out a problem for us in the way that we tend to engage certain stories in the Bible, of which Jonah is a prime example. We tend to look at this story with its fantastic, larger-than-life characters, its short narrative format, and its simple-sounding message, and we make it a morality tale with children with an easily digestible message. And usually the moral of the story is, be nice, don't be a jerk. Now, the problem is, as any children's minister will tell you, many biblical stories, and certainly Jonah, is not a simple story for kids. If you read and understand what the author is doing in the book, you realize it's much more complex and mature than many realize, and that makes it a difficult story to tell to children in its fullness. And by the way, I'm not saying that we shouldn't teach the Bible to children. We should, but we can't leave stories like Jonah at that. Because if we water them down, we risk missing the beautiful and poignant message that they're trying to teach us. Or to say it another way, we risk missing the message that God wants us to hear. And trust me, the story of Jonah is one that we need to hear right now. This book is incredibly beautiful. It's complex. It's a rich story packed into a total of 48 verses. I mean, seriously, look at it. It's tiny. The economy of writing here is extraordinary. The author knows what he's doing and is a talented storyteller. But he's also hilarious. Jonah is full of humor and satire and irony. Literally everything in this book is exaggerated and larger than life. And they're also the complete opposite of what you'd expect. So it's a beautiful and hilarious story, but it's also a really convicting story. And as we're laughing at these ridiculous characters with their ridiculous choices, we suddenly realize that we're actually laughing at ourselves. You see, this book is designed to be a mirror, and as we read it, we should consider how we would react if we were in Jonah's position. And we'll find that as we move through the story, Jonah is asked a number of questions. Some are posed by God, some are posed by other characters in the story, but we're intended to ask ourselves those same questions. So this is how the author reaches out and touches us. Biblical authors are brilliant in that they use crazy stories to sneak right past our self-preserving defenses. And then once the story lands, they grab us by the throat and they won't let us go until we apply it to our own lives. So by holding up the character of Jonah for ridicule and critique, the author hijacks our emotional and rational facilities, causing us to turn them on ourselves. So if we're reading Jonah properly, we should come away with from it with a feeling deeply challenged and affected. So let's begin. Jonah chapter 1 verse 1 says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai." And we have to stop right there. So in verse 1, we're introduced to our main character, Jonah. I mean, duh, right? But hold on. One of the reasons that we risk missing the power and the meaning of this book is because it's obscured, because it is what the author refers to, the people and places, the meaning is obscured by those things because they don't mean much to us. But they are loaded with meaning and significance for the audience of this book, the original audience of this book. So if we're going to grasp what the author intended, we need to do some investigative work. So who is this guy Jonah? Well, according to verse 1, he's the son of a guy named Amittai. And actually, we should be chuckling at this because Jonah means dove and Amittai means faithfulness, right? So his name is Dove, son of faithfulness, which is hilarious because if you know the story, that's the exact opposite of who Jonah is. So in the scriptures, doves are associated with purity and righteousness. And faithfulness means, that you're faithful. So already the author is messing with us because it's ironic. Jonah is neither of those things. But the question is, do we know any more about Jonah than what his name means? Well, actually, we do. He's mentioned once elsewhere in the Bible, in 2 Kings chapter 14. This same Jonah appears and prophesies to Jeroboam II, king of Israel. Now, Jeroboam ruled Israel between the years of 782 and 753 BC, 41 years. And he was a really bad king, like really bad. And yet Jonah brought word of the Lord to Jeroboam saying, look, God is going to give you victory over these wicked Assyrians. He's going to expand your borders and allow you to recapture the land that the Assyrians had taken by force. And then Jonah disappears and we don't hear from him again. So at this moment, in the imagination of those who originally read this story, to mention Jonah brings with it some baggage. So in their minds, Jonah is a prophet who prophesied God's favor over a really wicked king. Now, God is more than welcome to be gracious to wicked people. He's God. That's kind of his thing. But Jonah is associated with this prophecy. And it's actually a prophecy that later is reversed by Amos. God's people are so wicked that he actually allows Assyria to come back and mess with Israel all over again. So when we think of Jonah, we're thinking of a prophet who prophesied the expansion of the national borders of Israel under a really wicked king. So Jonah is a dubious character with questionable motives at best. Let's go on. Look at verse 2. It says, "Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." So once again, Jonah is called to prophesy, to speak a word of the Lord. That's what prophets do. They speak words on God's behalf. And God tells him to go to a city called Nineveh. Now the question is, what do we know about Nineveh? Well, in this verse, God calls it a great city, which makes sense because it's a capital city. The capital city of a very powerful nation, a nation that Jonah has already dealt with in the past. Can you guess it? It's the nation of Assyria. Nineveh is the capital of the nation of Assyria. And now we're thinking, wait a minute. Back in 2 Kings, Jonah prophesied that Israel would defeat Assyria. And now God is saying, go to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, and cry out against it? Well, yes, exactly. That's what we're saying. And this is unusual because normally when a prophet is called to speak against a city, he doesn't have to go to their home turf unless he's crying out against Israel. Right? So Assyria is an enemy of Israel. And God is telling Jonah to go to them and prophesy in their own capital city. And as we've seen in our day, speaking against the wrong and oppression in our own country, right, in the land of the free and the home of the brave, that can be dangerous. And what kind of people were the Assyrians, by the way? They were a powerful military state in the Old Testament that constantly oppressed the Israelites. And they were brutal and ruthless. They would famously conquer people, enslave them, cut their noses and ears off, and then they'd skin their enemies and hang their skins on the wall of the city as a warning to other nations not to mess with them. They were the kind of people that in their illustrations of their history, they would put the pictures of what their kings did to their enemies, right? So there's actually a famous picture of a bunch of heads piled up outside of a city. The Assyrians were the kind of people who bragged about that thing. They bragged about war crimes, right? Or what by today's standards would be war crimes. And not only were the Assyrians brutal to their enemies, but they were also brutal to one another. So the prophet Nahum calls Nineveh that bloody city. These were some seriously broken and messed up people, and yet these were people that Jonah has been called to prophesy against. And what reason does God give for telling Jonah to go and call out against the city? Look back at verse 2. It's because their wickedness had come up before God. In other words, God knows what goes on in Nineveh. He knows that they're wicked and broken and responsible for a whole lot of pain and suffering in the world, and now he intends to do something about it. He's about to intervene. But how does Jonah respond? Look at verse 3. It says, "But Jonah rose up to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So he went down to Joppa, found a ship which was going to Tarshish, paid the fare, went down into it with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord." So what does Jonah do? He runs. He flees. But he's a prophet, right? He's supposed to be the man that speaks for God. And right now, he's refusing to do his job. I mean, what? This is another place where the story messes with us because none of the characters in the book of Jonah respond how their stereotypes would suggest. So Jonah, dove, son of faithfulness, a prophet of Yahweh, refuses to be faithful to the word of Yahweh. His profession is to speak God's word, and yet he says, no, I'm not going to do that. But why? The question is, why is Jonah not willing to go and do that? Well, we don't know yet. The text doesn't say. All we know that Jonah is serious about not going to Nineveh, so he tries to run from God. And the word Tarshish, by the way, means the seacoast. And generally we understand that that refers to a Phoenician port city on the Mediterranean on the coast of modern-day Spain, like right before the Strait of Gibraltar. So this is important for us to know because Jonah didn't mistakenly get on a boat and go to the wrong direction. Like, seriously, look up on a map and see where Nineveh and Tarshish are. They're complete opposite directions from Jerusalem, or from Israel. Jonah is boarding a ship to take him as far away from God's mission as possible. Basically, in the ancient mind, he's running to the very end of the world, right? That's as far as they knew about at that time period. So God had a plan. God had a plan to push back evil in the world, and he called Jonah to be a part of it. But Jonah refused. God wanted Jonah to partner with him in what he was doing on earth, but for some reason, Jonah didn't like it. It didn't fit his view of how God should run the world, so he disobeyed God and ran away. And by the way, we should also get a laugh at the fact that Jonah tried to flee from the presence of the Lord. I mean, that's insane. Jonah is a prophet of God. He knows you can't get away from God's presence. One of God's attributes is, one of the attributes of God that makes God God is the fact that he's omnipresent, right? He's everywhere present all at once. You can't get away from God. So what an idiot, Jonah. You should know that you shouldn't be able to run. You can't run away from God's presence. I should know. I've tried. And now suddenly you see how the author puts his literary hands around our throat, right? So we may ridicule Jonah, but we also treat God in the same way all the time, all of the time. So as we're looking at Jonah and laughing at him, we need to realize Jonah isn't an idiot. He's doing what all of us do when we give in to sin and run away from God. He's becoming irrational. See, he really doesn't want to go where God has called him to go. God said, go. Jonah said, no, I'm going my own way. But he can't do that, and he knows it. But he wants so badly to get away from God that he's willing to disconnect himself from reality in order to keep from obeying God. In other words, he is so opposed to God's call that he's willing to live in a dream world rather than live in the real world that is ruled by God. He'll say, I'll just pretend that God can't follow me here, right? And if we're honest with ourselves, many of us know exactly what this is like. There are very few instances, I think, in our lives where we sin out of ignorance. Mostly we sin willfully or out of willful ignorance, right? We know what is right. We know what God expects. And we even know that to disobey him would lead to dire consequences, but we don't care. This is what's so insidious about sin, is that it lies to you and leads you down a path to destruction, but we're so stubborn and we want so badly to do it our own way, so stubborn about our view of the good life, that we're willing to ignore the basic truth that God runs the world, and I don't. Let's look at verse 4. The Lord hurled a great wind on the sea, and there was a great storm on the sea, so that the ship was about to break up. So, as you'd expect, Jonah doesn't get far before God intervenes. Not only is God everywhere present, but he also has the power to stop Jonah in his tracks. So I love this language. God hurled a windstorm at Jonah, right? And this windstorm is huge. In Hebrew, it literally says that the storm was so great that the boat considered breaking apart, as if the boat is a character thinking, I don't know if I'm going to make it, guys. I might break up. Now, the tragic part about this boat, it's the thing that Jonah has put his faith in, and it's about to fail him. So I think we need to think about how many of us try to take shelter from God relying on other things. Maybe you think you can get by relying on your physical beauty. People say yes to you just because you're gorgeous, or your athleticism, or your intelligence. Maybe you think you can rely on your own connections, your privilege, the fact that the world owes you what you want, or the fact that you're a good person. But you need to know that if you run from God placing your trust in someone or something else, it will fail you, just like this boat is about to fail Jonah. Now let's look at verse 5 through verse 9. Then the sailors became afraid, and every man cried out to his God, and they threw the cargo which was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone below the hold of the ship, lain down and fallen asleep. So the captain approached him and said, How is it that you are sleeping? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps your God will be concerned about us so that we will not perish. Each man said to his mate, Come, let us cast lots so we may learn on whose account this calamity has struck us. So they cast lot, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, Tell us now, on whose account has this calamity struck us? What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you? And he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. So, the storm strikes, and immediately the sailors realize that they're in big trouble. Apparently, the Hebrew word here for sailors means old salts, right? These guys know what they're doing, and they know that they're in trouble. So, to try to keep the boat afloat, they throw off the cargo that's in the ship to keep the bow above the waves. But, by the way, did you notice what they did first? They stopped and prayed. Now, these guys aren't praying to Yahweh, they're polytheists. And yet, this is supposed to shame Jonah, who knows the one true God, and yet doesn't call out to his God. So, in fact, he's asleep in the deepest part of the boat, and it's like he's completely indifferent to everything and everyone else around him. So the captain finds him and says, "What are you doing? If you won't help us keep the boat afloat by throwing stuff overboard, won't you at least pray to your God to save us?" And meanwhile, the storm isn't getting any better, so the sailors decide, look, we need to figure out why the gods are so upset with us. So they cast lots to see who's at fault, which I don't have time to explain, but basically it means they're rolling dice, and they believe that the gods communicated through the answer. And this time they were right. God did speak through the answer, because the lot fell on Jonah. So the sailors look at him and they ask him a bunch of questions, rapid fire, like, who are you? Where do you come from? What do you do? Basically, they're trying to get information about him so they can figure out why the gods are so ticked with him so they can fix it. And Jonah answers in verse 9 saying, "I am a Hebrew. I fear the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land." Basically, it's like he's saying, look, unlike you pagans who serve many gods, I serve the God of everything. And not only the God of everything, but the God who made everything. It's like he's bragging, "Oh, you silly simpletons, how silly of you to cry out to your gods who can't help you. Too bad you're not more like me, who serve the God above all gods." Right? And this answer doesn't exactly calm their nerves. Look at verse 10. It says, "Then the men became extremely frightened, and they said to him, 'How could you do this?' For the men knew he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them." So Jonah's arrogant answer doesn't just offend the sailors, it terrifies them. But why? Well, because he told them he's fleeing from God, the one who made and controls the seas, on a boat in the middle of the sea. And it's like they're saying, are you crazy? Now, look, we don't know it from what we've read so far, but Jonah has a serious problem. It's why he runs from God's mission to Tarshish. And it's why he has no regard for the safety of these sailors. Jonah is a racist. See, this is one of the reasons why this book is really difficult to teach to children. The book is about God's grace and about Jonah's grudge. It was written to address an issue that has often occurred in God's covenant people throughout history, including today. Often, those people who have been shown God's grace begin to take it for granted. They begin to see themselves as those who deserve God's grace, and so, because of their pride and their hard-heartedness, they begin to engage in tribalism and even racism. They become suspicious and judgmental towards others, and they dehumanize and marginalize anyone who isn't a part of their group, including the very people that God calls them to love. Now, if you can't see that this dusty old book is screaming relevance into our moment, I don't know what to do with you. Do you see it, though? The book of Jonah was written to expose the wickedness and hypocrisy of those who have been shown grace and yet refuse to extend it. And we, you and I, need to hear this word right now. And we need to allow it to search us and show us where we, like Jonah, have refused to be gracious as God has called us to. And here's something tragic about the story. We haven't even seen the lengths to which Jonah will go to run from God's grace. Look at verse 11. It says, "So they said to him, 'What should we do so that the sea will become calm for us?' For the sea was becoming increasingly stormy. And he said to them, 'Pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will become a great calm for you. For I know that on the account of me this great windstorm has come up upon you.' However, men rowed desperately, trying to return to land, but they could not, for the sea was becoming even stormier against them. Then they called on the Lord and said, 'We earnestly pray, O Lord, do not let us perish on account of this man's life, and do not put innocent blood on us. For you, O Lord, have done as you have pleased.' So they picked up Jonah, threw him into the sea. The sea stopped its raging. Then the men feared the Lord greatly and offered sacrifices to the Lord and made vows." So, now, see, the sailors realize that it's Jonah's fault that they're in this position, and they ask him what to do so that they won't all die. And Jonah says, "Throw me into the sea, everything will be okay." Which, look, not everybody agrees on this point. There are a number of different views about what's going on here. Some people think it sounds like Jonah's being heroic. He realizes his mistake, he's repenting. I don't think so. I don't think that Jonah's being heroic. I don't think he's trying to sacrifice himself so that they can go free. Because think about it. That's really not what he's doing. Jonah's not being heroic. Because, by the way, God isn't trying to kill Jonah or the men on the boat. God didn't send the storm to kill Jonah. He sent it to keep him from running any further. Right? So what Jonah needed to do was to tell the men, turn back and everything's going to be okay. But no, Jonah is determined to not go to the Ninevites so that he could answer God's call. Instead, he would prefer suicide. And not just suicide, by the way. Suicide would be Jonah jumping in by himself. He tells the sailors to throw him in. Right? Suicide is sinful. Jonah knows this. But if the sailors throw him in, then they would be responsible for his death. So once again, Jonah shows a total lack of concern for the sailors. He doesn't care about them at all. The sailors hear what Jonah says, and they ignore it. They actually try to row him out of harm's way. Why? Because apparently they care more for his life than they do for his. I'm sorry, they care more for his life than he cares for theirs. But alas, it doesn't work. They give in, throw Jonah into the sea. And notice, they even call on Yahweh for forgiveness, right? The sailors, it looks like they've come into saving faith. They call on Yahweh, and they make sacrifices to him. Like, everything in the story is totally upside down. Look at verse 17. It says, "And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the stomach of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights." So once again, Jonah tries to get away from God, and this time by having himself thrown into a certain death inside the ocean. But once again, God has other plans. Instead of drowning, God sends a fish to save him from death. And that's where the story ends for now. But before we go, I want us to sit with the question that the captain asks Jonah in verse 6. He says, "How is it that you are sleeping? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps your God will be concerned with us so that we will not perish." So this is one of those questions that you and I are supposed to ask ourselves. Because you see, God often uses other people to speak to us. Sometimes those questions even come from people who don't believe in God. And I think the question that God is asking Jonah, and he's asking you and me, through this captain is, how can you sit by while people are suffering? Jonah, I've sent you on a mission. I've called you to be a part of what I'm in the world. I'm calling you to extend my grace to people, to extend forgiveness to people so that they won't perish, to show them they're wrong so that they don't end up in a world of hurt. How can you refuse to be a part of what I'm doing in this world, Jonah? So my question to you and to me is, are you running from God? Has he called you and I to be a part of what he's doing in the world? Has he called us to join him in pushing back evil and spreading the good news? Has he called us to love people that are different than us? Has he called us to do something that is really, really difficult? To cry out against injustice and wickedness and evil. To point out the wickedness around us and say, this is leading us all to death. Look at the world around us. It's on fire. It's burning. People are hurting. And they're also looking for answers. Have you noticed that? Everybody's looking around saying, what is it that we need to do right now? And so many people are offering answers, but none of them are going to work. We have the answer. We have a gracious Savior who offers us forgiveness and then sends us into the world to forgive others. This is the gospel. It's the story of what God is doing in the world, and it's the only answer that can change anything. Not protests, not police, not politics. None of those things can ultimately save us. Only the gospel working through those things can work to change hearts and to change the world. My friends, how can we be silent when we have the good news that God has given us to the world? I hope that y'all consider that in the days and the weeks to come. We have the good news. How can we refuse to share it? How can we have our own vision of the good life that sets other people aside and prefers ourselves and our way of life? That's not what God has called us to. And I think we need to think about that. But in the meantime, blessings, friends. Come back next week where we're going to continue looking at this story. I hope it's helpful to you. I love you and I miss you. But hopefully we'll see you soon.